It was the winter of 1873 in the windswept town of Ashford Hollow, New York. The nights were long, the fog clung to the streets, and whispers traveled further than the lamplight could reach. Tucked at the edge of town, beyond the stone bridge and down a dirt path few dared to walk after dusk, stood a sprawling three-story building with tall Gothic windows and ivy crawling up its walls. Locals called it simply the Ashford Orphanage. To the children inside, it was both a home and a prison. For decades, the orphanage housed the abandoned, the lost boys and girls left behind by poverty, by war, by families too broken to hold them. But in the records of the county, something chilling lingers. In late November of 1873, the building was there. By the first week of December, it was gone. Not destroyed, not burned, gone, vanished without a trace, as if the structure and the dozens of children who lived within it had been swallowed whole by the earth. Newspapers of the era mention nothing. Town maps erase its location, and yet, hidden in the archives of a forgotten church basement, a faded diary records the last days of the orphanage, days of strange lights in the windows, shadows that seemed to move against the flame of lanterns, and the screams of children that no villager could mistake, though they swore to never admit hearing them aloud. Why did this place disappear? Who silenced its memory? And what horrors were buried with it? Before we dive in, tell me where you're listening from and what time is it there, because time itself is the enemy in this story. Time has tried to erase it, but tonight we will drag it back into the light. The origins of the Ashford Orphanage stretch back to 1851, when Reverend Jonathan Hale, a stern but well-respected clergyman, secured funds to build a haven for children left destitute in the wake of the cholera epidemic. Hale was a man of uncompromising faith, but one who believed discipline shaped the soul. To the townspeople, he was a savior. To the orphans, he was a shadow they could never escape. The building itself was striking. Constructed of pale stone with arched windows and long corridors, it resembled more a monastery than a home. It was said that at night, candlelight flickered from the upper rooms like eyes watching from the darkness. Inside, children were regimented into strict silence during meals, forced labor in the gardens, and endless sermons warning of damnation. But these were the practices of the time. No one questioned them. Not then. Yet beneath the pious surface, rumors grew. Servants whispered of children who vanished from their beds without explanation. Villagers claimed to hear hymns sung in strange tongues drifting from the chapel after midnight. And on certain nights, when the fog rolled thickest, people swore they saw a line of children led out into the woods behind the orphanage, never to return. In the margins of an 1869 parish record, a note remains: too many gone, too many graves unmarked. The Reverend says it is God's will, but my hands are not clean. The signature's illegible, scratched out, as if the writer feared discovery. At first, these stories were dismissed as hysteria. Children die of illness. Records are lost. Memory plays tricks. But patterns began to emerge. Between 1865 and 1872, 42 children were admitted. Only 12 appear in later census reports. Where were the others? In November of 1873, a teacher from a neighboring town, Clara Wells, visited the orphanage for the first time. Her letters, preserved in a family trunk, provide the only first-hand account of what life was like inside in its final days. She describes children with hollow eyes, terrified of speaking in her presence. She writes of rooms locked from the outside, where faint sobs echoed through the night. And she mentions something stranger still, a basement door sealed shut with iron chains, guarded at all hours by a single, silent caretaker. Clara wrote, "There are wings of this house where no one goes. The Reverend insists they are unsafe, but I feel the danger lies not in collapse of stone, but in what those rooms conceal." By the end of the month, Clara's letters stop. She's never heard from again. The last confirmed sighting of the Ashford Orphanage comes from a merchant named Elias North, who delivered coal to the building on November 28, 1873. He recalled seeing the Reverend pale and frantic, speaking to two men in dark coats unfamiliar to the town. The children were nowhere to be seen, though he heard crying from within. 4 days later, Elias returned. The dirt path was empty. The grounds were bare, as though the orphanage had never existed. Not a splinter of wood, not a single stone. Only the flattened imprint of foundations remained, soon swallowed by weeds and snow. Elias swore his testimony before a magistrate, but his words were struck from record. He died within the year, some say from fever, others from a mind tormented by what he had seen. For nearly a century, this story was reduced to whispers, until, in 1974, a historian cataloging artifacts in the Ashford County Archives stumbled upon a leather-bound book. Its pages smelled of mildew, its ink faded, but its words chilled the blood. The diary belonged to one of the orphanage's caretakers, and within it, she wrote of rituals conducted in the chapel basement. She described Reverend Hale speaking not of Christ but of sacrifice. She wrote of children chosen, their names erased, their memories deliberately buried. One passage reads, "The bells toll though no hand pulls the rope. The children wake screaming. They say the walls whisper. And the Reverend tells me not to fear, for soon the house itself will ascend." This diary was quietly shelved and forgotten, never studied, never published, almost as if someone wanted the silence preserved. We are left with fragments, a vanished building, dozens of missing children, a priest whose sermons grew darker with each passing year, and records erased by those who benefited from forgetting. But when history refuses to remember, we must ask, what force, natural or otherwise, could erase stone and soul alike? And more disturbing still, was the orphanage destroyed, or did it move, taken somewhere no map can mark? This is where the story begins. The disappearance of the Ashford Orphanage was not an isolated mystery. To understand its vanishing, we must return to the years before 1873, to the foundations of the town itself, and to the curious figures who gravitated around Reverend Hale. Ashford Hollow was not a prosperous place. Built upon land once sacred to the indigenous Mohican people, it was carved into by settlers who believed the soil was fertile. In truth, the earth was rocky, the winters brutal, families struggled, death was frequent, and in the aftermath of epidemics, children without guardians became a burden many could not afford. The orphanage, then, was more than a refuge. It was a solution, and Reverend Hale understood the power such an institution carried. Behind his sermons about salvation, he constructed a system where the unwanted were placed out of sight, under his control. He became not just a clergyman, but a gatekeeper of the forgotten. At first, this drew admiration. Wealthy patrons from Albany donated funds. Politicians praised him. But privately, some townsfolk noted that Hale's sermons had shifted in tone. Instead of redemption, he spoke often of purity, of cleansing the town of corruption, of fire that would sweep away sin. His orphans, he said, were souls to be tested. This rhetoric went largely unchallenged. After all, who would question a man who housed the destitute? But within the diaries of townspeople, preserved in family collections and sold to libraries decades later, the truth seeps through. A farmer's wife records how her son, placed in Hale's care after her husband's death, was never seen again. When she pressed for answers, she was told he had succumbed to fever. Yet no grave was marked, and no death certificate filed. Another entry, from a cobbler, notes that children placed at the orphanage seemed to fade thin as reeds, with eyes too large for their faces, as though something inside them was being drained. By 1871, whispers of Hale's special services began to circulate. These were gatherings at night, when the chapel doors were barred and only certain men from town were admitted. No women, no outsiders. What took place inside was never openly spoken of. But one account survives. A schoolteacher named Harriet Morrow claimed she heard chanting in a language she could not identify, low and rhythmic, followed by the sudden silence of extinguished lamps. The next morning, she wrote, "The windows of the chapel were blackened with soot, though no fire had burned." The final months of the orphanage were marked by an escalation of strange events. Clara Wells's letters, the ones discovered in her family trunk, mention a series of red flag signs that something more sinister was brewing within the walls. She describes children forced to memorize verses not found in the Bible, rooms that smelled of sulfur despite no hearth burning within them, a bell that tolled at 3 a.m, though the bell tower rope was cut years earlier, and most disturbingly, children disappearing not singly but in groups. Her last surviving letter, dated November 22nd, 1873, speaks of 7 children missing from their beds. Hale told the staff they had been adopted by families from Albany. Yet Clara noted there were no records, no visitors, no wagons. "It is as though they were plucked into the air," she wrote. The main incident, the night of the orphanage's disappearance, has never been reconstructed in its entirety, but fragments remain scattered across testimonies, rumors, and that lone caretaker's diary. From these sources, a chilling sequence emerges. On the night of December 1st, 1873, storm clouds rolled across Ashford Hollow. Witnesses in the village reported a strange glow emanating from the orphanage's upper windows, a flickering crimson light too steady to be lanterns. The bells of the chapel began to toll at precisely 3 o'clock. No one was seen pulling the rope. Children's screams echoed across the valley, carrying further than they should have. Villagers claimed they froze in their beds, unable to rise, as though held down by an unseen weight. Others swore the air itself thickened, pressing against their lungs. The caretaker's diary, written in a trembling hand, describes the Reverend leading a procession into the chapel basement. He carried a book, bound not in leather but in cloth stained black. The children, barefoot and silent, were arranged in a circle. Hale recited verses she did not understand, punctuated by the sound of something scratching against stone. She wrote, "The walls bleed light, the floor opens, I cannot," and the entry ends abruptly. Ink smeared as if the pen was torn from her hand. By dawn, the orphanage was gone. Villagers gave conflicting testimonies. Some denied the orphanage had ever existed. Others insisted they had heard the cries but feared speaking. A few, including Elias North's widow, swore the building had been taken into the sky, lifted in silence, leaving only the wind in its wake. One farmer claimed he found a fragment of stained glass a mile from the site, depicting an angel, but the face was blank, as though scratched away. No official records of the children remain. Their names, once inked in parish registers, have been blotted out, their birthplaces erased, as if history itself colluded with Reverend Hale to hide their existence. But here lies the first major twist. In the 1,920 seconds, nearly 50 years later, construction crews digging a well outside Ashford Hollow struck upon something buried deep, a small wooden box wrapped in cloth. Inside were bone fragments, locks of children's hair tied with string, and scraps of parchment scrawled with verses not in English, Latin, or any recognizable tongue. The box was quietly removed, stored in the university archive, and forgotten. Only decades later would linguists attempt to decode the writing. Their conclusion: it resembled no known human language. Some suggest that it was gibberish, others that it was a cipher, but one professor made a chilling observation that the letters mirrored shapes found in occult manuscripts dating back to medieval Europe, manuscripts tied to rituals of disappearance. If true, this suggests Hale did not act alone. He was part of something larger, something that stretched across centuries. And if so, what was his true motive? Salvation of children, or their sacrifice? The town moved on. The land was quietly sold, then abandoned. No one rebuilt on it. To this day, nothing stands where the orphanage once loomed. Only wild grass and silence. Yet the silence speaks, and those who have studied the fragments believe the children's voices are not gone, only waiting. The question remains, did Reverend Hale orchestrate the orphanage's disappearance as part of a ritual? Or did the building itself, the stones, the walls, the very air, become infected with something that could not be contained? The answer lies in the confrontation to come. As the years passed after 1873, Ashford Hollow lived with the silence like a scar. Families avoided speaking of the orphanage. Children born in the decades that followed were told nothing, and those who asked were met with stern glares and hurried dismissals. But secrets cannot be sealed forever. They seep out through documents misplaced, through confessions scrawled in private journals, through the voices of those too burdened to carry them into their graves. The first real fracture in the wall of silence came in 1891, nearly 2 decades after the disappearance. A traveling journalist, Samuel Whitaker, visited Ashford Hollow to write about the town's decline. He recorded a peculiar encounter with an elderly woman named Abigail Turner, once a laundress at the orphanage. In a hushed voice, she admitted she had seen things no good Christian woman should see. Abigail claimed Hale believed the children were Key's vessels for something beyond human. He said their innocence unlocked doors that men could not open, she whispered. But before Whitaker could press her for details, her family dragged her inside, refusing him entry. 2 weeks later, she was dead. Whitaker's notes, buried in a stack of unpublished articles, languished until rediscovered by researchers in the mid-20th century. They remain one of the few direct testimonies from someone inside the orphanage. The deeper scholars dig, the clearer it becomes. Hale was not simply a clergyman gone astray. His ties stretched further. In old records of fraternal organizations active in New York during the mid-19th century, Hale's name appears linked to a secretive society known only as the Novus Ordo Custodes, the New Order of Keepers. Little is known of this group, except that their surviving documents describe rituals meant to protect mankind from the encroachment of shadows. Their writings, however, are deliberately ambiguous. Were these men protecting humanity or binding it into darkness under the guise of guardianship? If Hale was their agent, the orphanage was no accident. It was chosen, a site of concentrated suffering, isolated from scrutiny, filled with malleable souls. A perfect vessel for an experiment no one was meant to survive. The foreshadowing red flags multiply when pieced together. Town records show a sudden influx of children into Hale's care in the months before the disappearance. Children from neighboring counties, even from as far as Pennsylvania. Many were brought without legal paperwork. It was as if Hale was gathering a final congregation. An unsigned letter, preserved in the attic of a judge's estate, describes a conversation overheard in late 1873. 2 men, identified only as the Reverend and the Doctor, spoke of the 13th night and of binding the house to the ground no longer. Historians speculate that this doctor may have been a physician from Albany, rumored to dabble in mesmerism and the occult sciences. If so, Hale was not working alone, but in concert with minds drawn to the forbidden. The moment of truth, the crime reconstructed in hindsight, is both horrifying and strangely precise. From the caretaker's diary and testimonies, researchers believe the ritual was staged not to kill the children outright, but to transfer them somewhere. Whether metaphysical or literal, the purpose was displacement. Hale's sermons had increasingly focused on ascension, the idea that suffering purified the soul, and that children, uncorrupted by vice, were vessels strong enough to carry humanity into another plane. But the language in his notes suggests something darker. He wrote of feeding the silence, and of offering the breath of children so the walls may open. These are not the words of salvation. They are words of bargain. The chilling possibility emerges. Hale was not seeking to lift the children into light. He was trading them, offering them to something in exchange for knowledge or power. The investigation into these revelations spanned generations, riddled with dead ends and deliberate obfuscation. By the early 1900s, when spiritualist movements were at their height, a handful of mediums claimed to channel the voices of Ashford's lost children. One seance transcript reads, "We are in the walls. We are beneath the earth. He told us we would be angels, but the dark took us instead." Skeptics dismiss these as theatrics, but the consistency across different mediums, none of whom knew each other, is troubling. Each spoke of the same symbols carved into the chapel's foundation, symbols only confirmed decades later when fragments of stone, unearthed by archaeologists, revealed patterns resembling those in medieval grimoires. Still, official channels remained resistant. County commissioners refused further digging. The church condemned any exploration as blasphemy. For every document revealed, another was hidden. The silence itself became a kind of conspiracy. Witness statements reveal more contradictions. Some villagers later claimed they had been threatened into silence by men who came from Albany in carriages at night. These men wore insignias not of local law enforcement but of fraternal orders. One widow confessed in 1905 that her husband had been paid to burn parish records that listed the names of orphanage children. Her words were ignored, dismissed as senility. But the ashes found in the church hearth corroborate her account. Piece by piece, the facade of natural disaster falls apart. Something deliberate happened at Ashford Hollow. The twist sharpens in the mid-20th century, when the box unearthed in the 1920 seconds resurfaced. Linguists who studied the parchment fragments discovered one passage that, when transliterated, formed a chilling command: "The house shall walk." What did that mean? Some scholars argue it was metaphorical, that the orphanage was meant to be spiritually detached from its foundations. Others, more unnervingly, take it literally. The absence of rubble, the lack of collapse, of fire, the barren earth. Could it be that the building itself was transported, that Hale's ritual was not destruction but translocation? If true, then somewhere, whether in this world or another, the Ashford Orphanage still stands, its walls intact, its children forever within. As the evidence piled up, the story reached its climax in historical confrontation. A 1979 symposium on forgotten American folklore featured a paper titled "The Orphanage That Walked," which brought all these fragments together. The scholar presenting it, Dr. Ellen Marbury, was ridiculed. Critics accused her of sensationalism, but weeks later, she vanished en route to a conference in Albany. Her car was found on a roadside. Inside was a briefcase still containing notes, pages torn from Reverend Hale's original Bible, annotated, rewritten, corrupted. In the margins of one page was a scrawled phrase: "The 13th child opens the door." Dr. Marbury had circled it in red ink. She had written a single question beside it: who was the 13th? Her disappearance was never solved. The question of the motive and planning grows heavier. Was Hale driven by madness, convinced he was delivering souls to heaven? Or was his motive cold calculation, a pact with forces he barely understood? Some believe Hale sought immortality, that by offering children, he could preserve himself in some hidden form. Others argue he was only a servant, following the commands of the Novus Ordo Custodes, part of a network using orphans as currency in their occult bargains. Whatever his motive, the results are the same. Dozens of children erased, their voices extinguished from history, their very existence scrubbed clean. And yet, history does not forget so easily. The whispers return, the documents surface, the land refuses to remain silent. Even today, visitors report a strange heaviness at the site. Some claim to hear faint weeping in the wind. Others say they see a shadow of the orphanage at dusk, shimmering in the fog, as though the building is still there, if only for a moment. If the orphanage truly walked, then where did it go? The answer, perhaps, lies in the shadows of what was buried in Ashford Hollow. And the final revelations may be darker than anyone dares admit. By the late 20th century, the Ashford Orphanage had become more legend than history. A ghost story whispered in hushed tones, a cautionary tale told to frightened children. Yet behind the folklore, something tangible remained. Not only the scattered documents, not only the fragments of glass or stone unearthed in the soil, but the persistent refusal of the past to stay buried. The media coverage that finally thrust the story back into public view came in 1987, when a regional newspaper ran a feature on New York's lost landmarks. Among the stories of abandoned mills and forgotten train stations, one small paragraph mentioned Ashford Hollow. The journalist dismissed it as folklore, a building that locals insist once existed, though no proof remains. The article might have ended there, another oddity relegated to trivia, but within weeks, letters poured in. Elderly residents from neighboring counties wrote to the paper, recalling tales passed down from their grandparents. Some included crude sketches of the orphanage, eerily consistent in detail, despite the miles and decades between them. Others enclosed documents, yellowed baptismal certificates, with names later struck out, receipts for cold deliveries signed Ashford Orphanage, photographs of children posed stiffly before a stone building no one had ever seen in official records. The paper ran a follow-up, this time on the front page. Did a town erase its own history? Overnight, the orphanage was no longer just a ghost story. It was an open wound. Public reaction was visceral. Some townspeople welcomed the exposure, claiming it was long past time to acknowledge what had happened. Others grew hostile, insisting nothing had ever existed, that the land was cursed because people kept speaking of it. Heated arguments erupted at town meetings. Property owners demanded excavation stop. The local church condemned the coverage as an attack on the dignity of Ashford Hollow. But silence was broken. The story could not be stuffed back into archives or hushed in darkened kitchens. Families came forward, desperate for answers. In the early 1992s, descendants of children believed to have been placed in the orphanage began requesting genealogical records. Many found only dead ends. Family trees cut off abruptly in 1873, entire lines gone, as though erased from memory itself. One woman broke down on camera, clutching a faded photograph of her great-grandmother as a girl. She always said she had a brother. His name was Samuel, but there's no record of him anywhere. She swore he went to the orphanage, and after that, nothing at all. The emotional impact on families was profound. What had been a generational silence now became generational grief. Descendants realized that their histories had been deliberately stolen, not by chance or disaster, but by calculated omission. Beyond the families, the aftermath rippled into society. The orphanage became the subject of documentaries, podcasts, even academic papers. Scholars debated whether Hale was a madman, a cult leader, or a pawn of larger forces. Occult researchers tied the symbols found on recovered stones to European grimoires and whispered of secret societies whose members believed in walking structures, buildings that could be severed from this world and transported elsewhere. Others took a psychological approach, that Hale exploited the language of religion to justify cruelty, that the children's suffering was not supernatural but all too human, hidden behind rituals and pious masks. The real horror, they argued, was not that the orphanage disappeared, but that the community allowed it to. And yet, the physical evidence still defied explanation. No rubble, no sinkhole, no fire. Witnesses reporting lights, sounds, impossible sensations. The warm earth beneath the vanished foundations. The phrase, "the house shall walk." Even skeptics were forced to admit something unexplainable happened at Ashford Hollow. Today, the site remains untouched, overgrown with grass and scrub, silent except for the wind. But visitors often report strange phenomena. Compass needles spin without direction. Audio recordings capture faint voices where no one stands. One team of paranormal researchers claimed they saw the outline of a 3-story structure shimmer in the fog just after midnight. When they rushed forward, there was nothing, only the grass beneath their feet, flattened as though something heavy had once stood there. Is this simply suggestion, the mind conjuring what it fears, or is it proof that the orphanage still lingers, trapped between worlds? So, what really happened? The most credible theory, drawn from decades of fragmented evidence, is that Reverend Hale orchestrated a ritual intended to sever the orphanage from reality itself. Whether he acted alone, driven by delusion, or under the influence of the Novus Ordo Custodes, remains uncertain. What is clear is that the children were pawns, offered in exchange, or used as conduits for whatever force Hale believed he was invoking. The motive? Perhaps Hale sought power, knowledge, or immortality. Perhaps he truly believed he was saving the children, lifting them to a higher plane. Or perhaps he was only a servant carrying out a plan larger than himself. But the result is undeniable. The children vanished, the building vanished, and history colluded to hide the truth. The conclusion is both chilling and unresolved. The Ashford Orphanage did not simply vanish overnight. It was erased deliberately, ritually, with a purpose we may never fully comprehend. The silence of the town, the destruction of records, the suppression of testimony, all point not to an accident, but to a cover-up. And yet, fragments remain, enough to suggest that the orphanage still exists, somewhere, perhaps buried beneath the earth, waiting to be unearthed, perhaps standing whole in a place we cannot see, filled with the echoes of children's cries. Why do some truths remain buried? Perhaps because to confront them would unravel too much, not just of the past, but of the foundations of faith, community, and human morality. To admit that entire lives were erased not by tragedy but by design is to confront a darkness far more terrifying than ghosts. So, the next time you pass an empty field or an abandoned foundation overrun with weeds, ask yourself, what once stood here? Who lived here? Who vanished here? And what bargains were struck to ensure we would never know? Because history does not always lose things by accident. Sometimes history is forced to forget. If this haunting journey into Ashford Hollow unsettled you, then you already understand why forgotten history must never be left to rot in silence. Subscribe if you want more of these buried stories unearthed. Share this with someone who believes history is safe, and let me know in the comments. Do you believe the orphanage was destroyed, or that it still stands somewhere, waiting,